Some war films were so real, the military used them to train pilots. One left its lead actor permanently scarred. And then there's the one so horrifying, Roger Ebert said it made survivors envy the dead. Here are the best movies ever made about World War II. Massive all-star cast in this one, covering the D-Day invasion from both sides. Life magazine straight up called it the longest headache, which, yeah, fair enough, because it's just under 3 hours long. It's a marathon, but the longest day pulls it off. A serious, no-nonsense recreation of events with Oscar-winning special effects and cinematography that still hold up. Based on the book by Cornelius Ryan, the film throws together a huge international cast: John Wayne, Robert Mitchum, Richard Burton, and a young Sean Connery. D-Day veterans were brought in as consultants, making sure they got every detail right. Richard Todd wasn't just playing a soldier, he was there. He fought in Normandy as part of Operation Overlord. The Longest Day wasn't just a critical hit, it was a box office giant, making over $50 million in 1962. War movies don't get much bigger than this. Operation Overlord, the code name for the Battle of Normandy. This stark, low-budget war film follows one young soldier from boot camp straight to his death on Sword Beach. Shot in black and white, with cinematography by Stanley Kubrick's go-to guy, John Alcott, and it blends with real archive footage so well, you'd swear it was all the same. Feels nothing like The Longest Day, completely different in scope and approach, but just as effective. Alistair MacLean cranked out thrillers like a machine, but most of his books didn't get great film adaptations. The Guns of Navarone was the exception, Where Eagles Dare delivers as well. A full-throttle blockbuster packed with action, written by MacLean himself while he was still working on the novel. The star power is a huge part of why it works. Richard Burton and Clint Eastwood lead the charge, taking on a high-stakes rescue mission inside a fortress designed to be impenetrable. The Nazis don't stand a chance against them. MacLean's signature twists are all over this one, and yeah, some of them push reality. But none of that matters when the action hits this hard. The fight atop the mountain cable car is still a standout. Gregory Peck, in a role that got him an Oscar nod, plays a general who steps in to fix a bomber squadron wrecked by the emotional toll of war. He's cold, calculating, completely ruthless, because he has to be. But even he isn't immune. 12 O'Clock High was one of the first movies to dig into the psychological cost of war, and it hit hard. The military used it as a training film for decades. Not just them, either. Corporations, emergency services, even hotel chains studied it to understand how leadership pressure wears people down. Massive box office hit. A lineup of murderers, psychopaths, and army prisoners all sent on a suicide mission behind enemy lines with the promise of redemption. Classic audience manipulation cranked up to the max, and it works because the cast is that good. Lee Marvin leads the charge, backed by Robert Aldrich at his most cynical. The whole thing is pure nihilism, no illusions of heroism here. And Charles Bronson wasn't just playing a soldier. He served in World War II and was awarded a Purple Heart. Sam Fuller wrote and directed The Big Red One based on his own combat memories. "I wanted to do the story of a survivor," he said when the movie premiered at Cannes, "because all war stories are told by survivors." The film follows a group of American soldiers from wide-eyed recruits to battle-hardened veterans. At the center of it all, Lee Marvin is the tough but quietly compassionate sergeant holding them together. Fuller didn't do sanitized, feel-good war stories. He made films about the chaos, the waste, the futility, and this one is his absolute best. Martin Scorsese called Fuller's war films the truest, the toughest, the least sentimental. The Big Red One is all the proof you need. One of the defining British war films. Iconic theme music, special effects that were groundbreaking for their time, and a no-nonsense retelling of the mission that took out two of Germany's Ruhr dams in 1943. Engineer Barnes Wallis spent years perfecting the bouncing bomb, and the film captures every grueling step of getting it ready for one of the most daring raids of the war. A patriotic tribute to unsung heroes, but not one that sugarcoats anything. The cost was real, and the film never lets you forget it. The censors gutted a lot of what made James Jones's novel so controversial. but Fred Zinnemann still managed to pull off something great. The cast is stacked. Burt Lancaster, Montgomery Clift, Deborah Kerr, and Donna Reed, who walked away with an Oscar. And then there's Frank Sinatra, proving he could actually act, with or without a horse's head, and winning Best Supporting Actor. The recreation of the Pearl Harbor attack is a standout, but the whole thing cleaned up at the Oscars, taking home 8. Based on the true story of Allied prisoners pulling off a mass breakout from a German prisoners of war camp, but Hollywood's version makes it a lot more fun than reality. The upbeat adventure movie feel doesn't quite match the fact that most of the real escapees were executed, but that hasn't stopped The Great Escape from becoming one of the most beloved war films ever made. A holiday staple, endlessly rewatchable, and part of that comes down to the cast. Big international names, Steve McQueen, Charles Bronson, Richard Attenborough, and some, like Donald Pleasance, actually had been prisoners of war themselves. Clint Eastwood made this as a companion to Flags of Our Fathers, which told the story from the American side. This one's from the Japanese perspective, and it's the better of the two. Stripped down, honest, and the kind of film that only happens when a director is at the absolute top of his game. Eastwood takes soldiers who were painted as faceless enemies in so many other war films and makes them human. Men fighting a battle they had no chance of winning. After 2 decades away from filmmaking, Terrence Malick came back with this adaptation of James Jones's autobiographical novel. The Thin Red Line follows American soldiers fighting for Guadalcanal, but this isn't a typical war movie. It's Malick's take, focused on atmosphere, human nature, and the disconnect between soldiers and the chaos around them. The cinematography is precise, the landscape's almost surreal, and the contrast between untouched nature and total destruction drives everything home. It's been called one of the greatest war films ever made, and it's locked in the National Film Registry. A war epic set in Japanese-occupied Burma with Alec Guinness as the British colonel so determined to prove his men's discipline that he builds a bridge for the enemy without realizing what he's doing. Alec Guinness took home an Oscar for playing Colonel Nicholson, but behind the scenes it was chaos. The original script had elephant charges and screaming women in the jungle. David Lean threw all of that out and rebuilt it from scratch. It's a battle of wills as much as a war film, and David Lean keeps the tension at its peak. 7 Oscars, including Best Picture and Best Director, a mainstay on TV for a reason. A defining film of Italian neo-realism. Rossellini shot it in the open streets post-war, in a city still reeling from Nazi occupation, and it captures war with a level of realism most films can't match. The Italian resistance fights to survive while the occupying forces close in, and Anna Maniani delivers one of the strongest performances in war cinema. Rossellini's filmmaking resources were limited, as is apparent in the film, since he uses natural lighting, non-professional actors, and a delicate sound system. But it only gives the film a stark and more authentic look, making the atmosphere more terrifying and the experience more real. Most of the props and sets, and even many of the Nazi soldiers, were real. Unlike many historical films, this one does right by the historical facts, even though it's a work of fiction. Das Boot is the ultimate submarine movie, period. One of the most intense war films ever made, following a German U-boat crew in the Battle of the Atlantic. No glory, no heroics, just endless tension, claustrophobic horror, and the slow grind of survival. Wolfgang Petersen keeps the camera tight in the sub, pulling the audience into the sheer exhaustion and paranoia of the crew. The sailors aren't Nazi fanatics, and the film leans into that divide while never letting up on the pressure. It's been released in 5 different cuts, including a version that turned it into a BBC miniseries. It picked up 6 Oscar nominations, a Golden Globe nod, and it's still considered one of Germany's greatest films. One of the toughest war films out there, and it's animated. A brother and sister, orphaned by the firebombing of Kobe, try to stay alive as the war closes in around them. Their world gets smaller with every passing day. Less food, fewer people willing to help, no way forward. Studio Ghibli adapts Akiyuki Nosaka's story, drawn from his own memories, without making it easier to digest. Christopher Nolan's take on the Dunkirk evacuation locked itself in as one of the greatest war films the second it hit theaters. 3 stories run in parallel: the soldiers trapped on the beach, the RAF pilots fighting to protect them, and the civilians crossing the channel in their boats to pull off a rescue mission against impossible odds. The sound design alone makes it one of the most intense, immersive war films ever made. No Hollywood movie had ever shown war like this before. The first 30 minutes at Omaha Beach are pure, relentless carnage. Spielberg throws you straight into it, no build-up, no warning, just chaos. But it doesn't stop there. The story follows Tom Hanks leading his squad deep into enemy territory to bring home one man, the last surviving brother in his family. It leans into sentimentality at times, and yeah, it plays on emotions, but there's no denying it set a new standard for the genre. One of the most brutal war films ever made. This isn't just a story, it's a full-blown nightmare. Pulled from the real-life experiences of writer Alice Adamovich, it follows a 14-year-old Belarusian boy as he gets dragged into the resistance and forced to witness the full horror of Nazi brutality. No heroics, no glorification, just war at its most horrifying and senseless. Famous film critic Roger Ebert called it one of the most devastating films ever. A legendary Hollywood romance that also happens to be a war film. Most of it takes place inside Rick's cafe, but that wartime tension never lets up. The Nazis are closing in, everyone's looking for a way out, and by the time the final moments hit, it delivers one of the greatest endings in film history. Everything lined up perfectly: cast, script, music, direction. Casablanca doesn't just hold up, it still defines the genre. Spielberg's most personal, most devastating film. The fact that it's a true story makes it hit even harder. Oskar Schindler starts out chasing profit, using cheap Jewish labor in Krakow to build his fortune. But as he watches the full horror of the Holocaust unfold, everything shifts. He spends everything he has bribing Nazi officials to keep his workers out of the extermination camps. More than 1,100 people survived because of him. 7 Oscars, endless praise, and still one of the most powerful films ever made.